Hello and welcome back to GraphQL Fireside Chats. My name is Sarah Renaud with This.Labs. This event is part of a 4-part online series hosted with Hasura. Each week, we will focus on GraphQL and a different front-end framework. This week is all about GraphQL and Angular. Our sponsors today are This.Labs and Hasura. This.Labs are your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. Find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Hasura is an open source engine that connects to your databases and microservices and auto-generates a production-ready GraphQL backend. You can read more about Hasura at hasura.io. We have a very exciting online conference happening this week. GraphQL Enterprise Connect will be this Friday on August 14th. GraphQL Fireside Chats continue next week. Join us for our final Fireside Chat with GraphQL and Relay on August 18th. We also host monthly GraphQL meetups, so check out graphql-meetup.com for more information. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today's Fireside Chat. Tanmai Gopal, founder of Hasura, Bonnie Brennan, Angular GDE and founder of AngularNation.net, Chris Whited, platform engineer and blogger at Ultimate Courses, Uri Goldshtein, founder of the Guild, and Camille Casiela, open source developer and member of the Guild. Welcome, everybody. And with that, I'll hand things over to Tanmai.
Hey everyone. Nice to be here again. It's been a whole week since we've last met, so that's great. I'm so happy to be hosting everyone today with old friends and new. And so, we'll kick things off with a small introduction. As the very first person I knew in the Angular ecosystem, my first friend in the Angular ecosystem, Bonnie, would you like to kick things off with an introduction?
Hi, how are you? It's so good to see you, and thank you for inviting me. I was really excited to see your name. I haven't seen you in a while. So I'm an Angular GDE. I've been doing Angular since about 2013. I've been doing GraphQL, I think, since 2016, 2017, and I love it. I've been recommending it to my clients for quite a while. And I just started AngularNation.net, so I have this site where people can go and talk to each other and get some training and get some help with specific questions that they have. And we just started Angular architect training over there too. So I'm very excited to be here.
That's awesome. And what is kind of how is the Angular and GraphQL story evolved for you over the last few years? Do you get to do most of your work with GraphQL, a little bit of your work with GraphQL, not as much as you'd like? What's that looking like?
So I first came across GraphQL when I was working on a client project. The client had actually implemented Ngrx and GraphQL, and then there were 2 Redux stores. So I went to Uri and I said, hey, can you help me resolve this? Because I want to have only one single source of truth and not 2. And he talked to me about the Ngrx and what we were doing with state management. And then he said, you don't actually need all that code. And I was like, what? But I worked really hard. It's all working. It's great. And so he helped me learn and get it implemented. And after that, I was hooked. I mean, once you've done GraphQL, it's just so clean. It's so beautiful. So the problem, I think, with after that is going, I go from client to client, like a consulting and helping teams. And a lot of times by the time they call me in, they've already got a lot of code. And so it's like trying to steer a freight train. It's hard. And getting them to switch over to GraphQL after they've already got this. But I keep pushing for it because it's less code and it's just beautiful. Don't get me started. I'm a big fan. I'm very excited about the work that all of you are doing, and I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you, Bonnie. That makes sense. And I think like there is this overall engineering maxim of saying, right, don't fix what's not broken. But I think the shining beacon of light who goes against this philosophy is Uri, who's just like, that's okay. All of this works, but I will still fix it. And Uri is one of the few people I trust to do right by that. But with that, Uri, would love for you to introduce yourself as well. And what you've been doing with Angular and GraphQL.
Thanks for this amazing introduction. Now, all my pitch when I come to companies and I tell them you don't need to change anything is gone. You ruined my story. Thank you for that. No, I'm. So thanks. I'm Uri. So I used to work at Apollo, and when I was in Apollo, I was like the Angular guy. And while we just started Apollo, I was tasked with the task of like integrating Apollo and Angular. So I just initiated it. And thank God, Camille basically built everything. So, but then after I left Apollo, I got the great chance to work with Camille. And we worked together in the guild and maintaining Apollo Angular. And also in that context, like the main we actually worked, most of the time we worked on Angular Meteor was we basically built probably the highest traffic Angular application in the world. So all the lessons that we learned during that actually went into Apollo Angular. So yeah, so that's me.
No, that's awesome, and super happy to have you here as well, Uri. Camille, would you like to go next with a quick intro?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Camille. As Uri said, we been working together for almost 5 years or something. So I started basically with PHP, Angular, and this kind of stuff. And yeah, at some point we met with Uri on the open source space, probably on the Angular Meteor, as I remember correctly. And since then we pretty much hang out every day, except weekends. But yeah. And and basically our work is related to GraphQL in recent 3-4 years, something like that. Yeah.
That's
it's
that's
a
awesome.
successful story.
That's no great to have you here as well, Camille. Chris would love for a quick introduction as well.
Yeah, my name is Chris. I'm a senior software engineer for a company in Kansas City, Missouri, working in actually right now a little more on the React side. But I used to work for this dot actually, and I've done a lot of consulting and done a lot of work in the GraphQL space, both on like personal projects and things. I'm working to co-found a nonprofit, and the app that I built for that to help people with COVID income loss. I used with GraphQL and Apollo actually, Apollo React and Apollo serverless. I've also done a lot of consulting in the GraphQL space with a lot of companies all over the United States, a couple internationally as well. And then my history comes from a lot of Angular, from the early Angular 2 days, Angular JS, and then working with different layers to connect it to GraphQL and saw the power of resilient components based off some and the API. So that's the conversation I get to have a lot of times with people, is go into companies and help them see like the areas where GraphQL can help them solve the problems that they have. I actually like to market myself, so Uri and I have a lot in common there, where it's even if what they have is fine, I'm still like, but there's still something we could do a little bit better. So that's a little bit about me. And I also do work with Ultimate Courses and do some blogging and work with Cosmodo and help with that as well.
That sounds awesome. Thanks a lot for being here, Chris. So yeah, I mean, I think well, I'll also introduce myself quickly before we get started. In that case, I'm Tanmai. I'm one of the founders at Hasura. Built Hasura a while back to kind of solve the a data access problem and a kind of a JSON problem, and we'd invented our own version of GraphQL, which we called RQL. And as we were kind of working with it and we were kind of thinking about it, we were like, hey, people told us this is a lot like GraphQL. This should just be GraphQL. And we were like, sigh, all right, fine, we'll add GraphQL support, but we still support our ancient our other language. So our UI still in portions uses that language because it's far more powerful than GraphQL. What do you know? But that's kind of been our journey with GraphQL over the last 2 years. And I don't have too much experience with Angular, so I'm going to be the happy person who's asking lots of stupid questions, and I'm going to be learning a lot over the next 60 minutes. But with that said, would love to kick the conversation off talking a little bit about kind of what the API integration and remote data story for Angular applications has been like, and how that's evolved, without GraphQL. So if people are not using GraphQL or before GraphQL today, what does that API integration and remote data story look like, especially in comparison to other kind of popular frameworks? Let's say vanilla JavaScript, let's say React. What does that API integration story look like with say REST APIs? Anybody feel free to pick this up and kick things off.
I see a lot of Ngrx. I see a lot of state management that's happening on the client. And you know what I see? I didn't realize that it was a pattern until I was consulting with a lot of different teams. What I see time and time again is when the teams grow, that you have eventually they switch into a front end team and a back end team, and the front end and back end team sometimes are not sitting next to each other anymore. They might not even be in the same building, and somehow they don't communicate anymore, and they're in different planets. And so sometimes when they're fetching data from the back end, it's not exactly right. They got to map it. They got to do all this, and there's, relationships. So what I see a lot is they're writing a lot of code on the front end, which in the code works, right? And so they can do all of this. They can write all the services and get, do all the sorting and filtering that they need. But the problem is when they put it all on the client, I remember Uri actually was the one who taught me this, because I was so frustrated with Uri when I first met him. I was like, but, and I said, why, if we're still using an old database and we're doing all of this in GraphQL, the code is the same, right? And all I'm doing is moving the code. What's the point of that? And he said, well, because it's all happening, right there very quickly, and you're not going back and forth across the Wi-Fi when you're doing all those lookups. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's genius. So it looks a lot like the GraphQL reducers, what the code that I see in, Ngrx. It's actually still Redux, but it's all in the client, which makes that client bundle. And over time, when it grows and gets bigger and bigger, because once they introduce it, you have developers come along and they use it for everything. So every little CRUD, anything that happens, even the simple stuff, it's all going through that state management, and it just ends up with so much overhead. So that's a challenge that I see, and it gets bigger and bigger, and yeah. So I try to get them, and I learned it from Uri. So thank you, Uri. And now I just try to convince other people.
Yeah, it's very interesting that GraphQL is kind of almost seems to be solving a more of a human problem than a technical problem, right? Where humans just don't want to talk to each other anymore, and so the front end and the back end team doesn't want to talk to each other anymore, and they don't want to be dependent on each other to kind of build these APIs and things that the other team needs, right? So GraphQL is a perfect fit in that case, right? Where you're saying, I don't need to depend on this team to give me a different shape of data, a different slice of data, a different piece of data, and I can just go get this myself, which is incredibly enabling, right? Which is incredibly useful, especially the larger and the more complicated your application is, or the larger your organization is, even, right? So I think, yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And maybe as somebody kind of super new to Angular, what are kind of the high level concepts when you think of API integration with an Angular app, right? Is it what does the data flow look like? Is it is it similar to like a Flux style one-way data flow where you click on something, you have an action that goes and triggers a remote data fetch, which then goes and updates a central state store, and the central state store propagates that to different components, or is it a slightly different architecture with Angular in general? Uri, Camille, Chris, any one of you would like to teach me a few basics here?
Yes, I think
I can try. Oh yeah, you can.
Okay. So I mean, I think that like when I started with Angular, this in GRX days, like you would see like a very you could tell it was like the Angular ecosystem really supported this service layer concept. So you have these services that were singleton instances in your app, and they would communicate with the API, get the data, and then I'd see them like those services being shared, and then this data in the service layer, and then you'd have services like managing your state for you, and they'd be calling to the API, getting the data, persisting it locally, or you'd see just like wild prints out onto the screen of the data retrieved from the API, and like these services that would just everything was .subscribe. you just see dot subscribes everywhere, and then they'd be populating like class properties with the new data that received from the service layer from the API. And so it was kind of wild. And then I remember seeing Ngrx in 2017, and that kind of shifted it. But yeah, like before it, to me, it was just like this weird sort of, well, I did Java or .NET before, and I take that very like service layer approach and with a repo layer and just applied it to front end, where it was just like, well, now I have the data. What do I do with it? I don't know. I'll just put it onto the screen. So that has kind of changed as we were talking about earlier. Is like now we see all these things where it's like our API stuff doesn't care. So now it's not like it just this us versus them mentality, and we see a lot of just like throw it up and then the client has to deal with it, and the clients are bad at it. That's not what they're made for. All that data coming over the wire really slows them down. And so that's what I saw in the Angular ecosystem. Is like, wow, this is really powerful. But does it need to be this powerful, or are we just solving a different problem?
Okay, no, that makes sense. Uri, you were saying. Sorry, go ahead, Bonnie.
Well, it's more like what Chris was saying. I wanted Uri actually to explain it the way he explained it to me, because I thought it was really he explained it very well. Uri, tell them what you told me about even if you can't get the backend developers to use it at all, you can still benefit from this middle layer.
Yeah. So I think the Angular world is an interesting one, because I think AngularJS was highly popular, and AngularJS introduced all kinds of concepts, like what Chris said before. Like we had an Angular services, which were kind of like a class that holds a resource, and that class like takes care of anything related to fetch that resource, usually just like REST requests, like CRUD operations with REST requests and things like that. And then just you bind that resource or service into the front end. Then, once we moved into, Angular, just Angular or Angular 2 at the time, we were introduced to the reactive infrastructure and Ngrx, which is more it's just like Redux, basically, like an immutable store. And we would load the, just like you mentioned at the beginning, Tanmai, like that you initiate a request or a click or a button, then it goes through like, this, like this, like one-way
data flow kind of thing.
Data flow, and then, we bring the data, we put it in the store and everything. That the difference was, I think at that time, that which I think is actually interesting, is that at that time Angular was very highly integrated with TypeScript before the React community started adopting it. So people wrote like Ngrx stores, and they wrote basically all the properties already. Like they created kind of like a GraphQL schema on the store. That schema, the TypeScript typings, basically reflect your backend data, like what you want from your backend data, and a bit of the front-end data or local state management. The problem is, or the difference is, that those types are just, they're just there for build time. Like you don't do anything with those types information at runtime. But with GraphQL, like you can use that typed information in order to create some query, in order to like do some more automation at runtime, the good thing about when I'm talking to like Angular developers is that the schema that they're going to create, which is kind of like the schema of the front end, what the front end wants to do with the data, you have a good way of describing it. That schema is already there usually. It's just it's written in TypeScript. So sometimes the first initial, I think, way that most of our clients are starting to use GraphQL is that they're just taking that TypeScript schema, writing it in GraphQL, and then still call the backend in REST APIs. But they kind of like run their own small GraphQL engine on the client, and then they get to query GraphQL queries in the components, which might start to introduce new concepts that I'm sure you'll touch later about, like with co-location of data and things like that.
Interesting. So So just to kind of maybe repeat what I heard, if I understood right, was that the kind of the architecture without GraphQL, if you're using an Angular app, is similar to kind of a Redux architecture that React developers might be familiar with, which is you have kind of this central store, different events that happen go and cause updates to the store. This store, because of Angular's TypeScript adoption fairly early on, this entire store would have a schema which was written in TypeScript, and then as entities in that store would get updated, it would kind of go reactively update different components that were subscribed to that store, right? And so what was happening was, people, when it came to API integration, people were basically, whenever there would be an action that would go call a particular API endpoint, the result of that API endpoint, which was maybe an untyped result, would then be converted into a piece, an object of the right type, and then be added to the store, and then the rest of the Angular application would take over. Is that correct in the world before
Exactly.
GraphQL? Okay, got it.
Yeah, but sometimes you have to have more than one trip to put it all together, because those
Right,
they grow, and
right.
so there's a lot of data and then there's logic that you got to put it all in there.
Right.
Or you get
right.
far
Yeah,
too
and
much
so
data because you're looking at a list and you're getting a giant object that has all of its nested dependencies, and you're like, I just needed the name and the ID, bro. Like, I didn't need the whole thing. But you don't get that choice, right? Like, you just get what you get, and you make.
You'll take all of it.
Right? Yeah, and then you either filter it out on the front end, which still means it's data over the wire, or you just don't hide it. You don't show it in the UI, which again is still data over the wire and still being managed by your app.
Right, exactly. And I think also there's kind of like interesting conversation that you always need to have with where to put the transformation, right? Do you transform that data a little bit as soon as you get the response and put it into the store, or do you transform the data once you have it in the store and then the UI components transform it a little bit, right? And it's always a little bit messy.
Layer?
Yep. So it's a little bit confusing, and there's always a little bit of a spectrum, right? People always do a little bit of whatever works, but that's interesting. And then Uri, if I understood right, the second part of what you were saying was, what people started doing was when they wanted to kind of think about GraphQL, one way of thinking about GraphQL is that instead of having a typed store, I can have a GraphQL schema that describes this store, and the things that populate this store, which is now typed by the GraphQL schema, are actually executed through little GraphQL resolvers and stuff like that, which are effectively then going and calling their own legacy REST endpoints, right? And so that kind of becomes one way that people have started thinking about adopting GraphQL and having a GraphQL first experience on the front end, using all of the GraphQL tooling on the front end, but then having a small GraphQL kind of engine at the front end that is doing the GraphQL to REST API kind of compat layer. Is that a accurate summary of what you said in the second part?
Yeah, that's exactly that. And like, we recently started working with Microsoft, and apparently they're doing that as well. So it was interesting to see that, like, this, we all call it unorthodox way of using GraphQL, is actually extremely powerful in a lot of large companies,
right.
And it has a lot of benefits, even if putting aside all the amazing benefits that everyone knows about GraphQL, which is like the less request over the network and the less data over the network.
Right. Got it. And
less code in the client bundle.
Yeah, same.
And yeah, that's like a. I think once people kind of start seeing that there's less code that I'm writing and there's less code that I'm shipping, I think it starts becoming pretty clear that you kind of want to start moving towards GraphQL as much as possible, right? And when those kind of first steps happen, right? Like, suppose I have this application, I'm using Ngrx, I have this store structure. What does that kind of first step towards GraphQL look like when now, let's say, for example, I have a GraphQL API already, right? I don't let's not talk about the advanced kind of idea of having a little GraphQL engine on the front end, but let's say I have this GraphQL API now, right? What does what does that kind of incremental adoption look like? Do we think about, do we keep our central store and then do we start integrating the GraphQL APIs like we would have the REST APIs, or do you recommend that I rip out that entire central store and I change that with a GraphQL first store or a GraphQL cache or whatever we want to call it on the front end? What do those kind of first steps look like when I have this existing application and I want to start integrating my new GraphQL APIs into that Angular application?
I would personally start at looking at the state and find out basically which pieces of data are stored in the global store, but they sort of are used in the one or two components. So then you have this chunk of data that is actually independent from the other pieces of the store. So you start there. And I would say that all the REST API calls could be possibly replaced with GraphQL queries. So then you have this, GraphQL under the hood, but and then you can slowly move from actions and effects and all kinds of stuff into pretty much just calling a query and selecting a query with the selector of Ngrx. I would start that. I'm not quite sure. I would also add to the thing before that people think about Ngrx and GraphQL as something different, but then what you end up in some, highly performant application is basically GraphQL. So you do Ngrx, caching, normalization, and sort of all this kind of stuff, which is something that Apollo or Relay or any other GraphQL client does it already because of the schema. So, you write less code and also less logic. So it's
right. Makes sense.
So yeah.
Sorry, Bonnie,
I would agree with that, but I think there's one step before that, Camille, because one of the struggle, well, really the big struggle I think I've had with the getting clients to use GraphQL is talking them into it, because I work with so many big clients and they already have all this code and they think it's just a big architectural decision, it's a big commitment, and I just don't have time, and talk to me, in a couple months. And so what I've learned, and it was frustrating for a while, but I actually found a great tactic. So if you're having this problem where you're on a team and you want to implement this and there's just not time, it's beautiful, because what you need to do is you need to do a proof of concept, just a little bit, just make a little and show them the graphical, show them the interface, just show them a little bit, and then it's much more effective. And then you get to the next step, which is what Camille said. That I think has been because having the conversation and saying, hey, I think GraphQL will help you, has really, sometimes people are like, oh, I'm too busy, I don't have time. But you have to show them, really. And I think if you do that, even with just a little proof of concept, and then they see it and they go, oh, wow, that's our data right there. And then it's much easier after that.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think it would be. I think the and kind of flows into what Camille was saying as well, right? Which is that the starting point becomes, let's just replace the REST endpoints that we have with GraphQL queries. And the best way of asking people to do that is by just taking a look at GraphQL, right? Just like, hey, just try this query out and just see what it feels like. And then you're like, oh, okay, I don't actually want to make a REST endpoint, a REST API call anymore. I want to use this query. And then you maybe take that and replace your REST endpoints as a first step. And not change your entire application. You just use that as a first step, and then gradually kind of move towards over removing those portions and then just changing that using something like Apollo client or a GraphQL client that handles that for you. But kind of,
I have maybe I can add to it just one more small things. So I think. One thing that is important to say is that two things that I think is important to say. One is that you can do it gradually, and both GraphQL and REST can live together side by side for the rest of the world. Like for the end of times. Like you can just start with one. Let's say you have one endpoint, and that endpoint is like, I don't know, or the backend and the front end iterating about that a lot, or it's a slow endpoint or whatever. You can start with one single endpoint, but still keep doing whatever you've done before. So it's completely gradual migration. So it's not GraphQL or REST. Like you can basically, for a very long while, you can make them live together side by side, and see the benefits, and then what we see is just naturally things evolve into GraphQL. Like you don't need to push it too much once you start small. The other thing is when you introduce GraphQL to people, and Bonnie touched on it, is that, so first of all, like show it, but then also to mention that GraphQL is kind of like an evolution of a lot of things we had before. So it's not instead of other things. So there's a schema, and you can introspect a schema, and you can generate SDKs or types or things from it. When you talk to a lot of developers and you come and say, well, GraphQL is this completely new thing and it's so amazing, developers that are used to use OData, for example, we just are doing now with Microsoft, are like, wait, but we already have a lot of those things. That's true. So I think actually, instead of saying like it's much better than that, it's just to show that it has a lot of the good stuff from, you know, existing solutions, but it's kind of like bundling them all together, and it's all, plus adding some extras. So yeah, so I think it's important to note that like it's in, yeah, exactly. It's like a small evolution on all those great other ideas.
Yeah, makes sense. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I would add also that the education, as you mentioned, is like highly important and beneficial, because people also in some cases are afraid of asking questions, and they think that GraphQL is something, I mean, that they have this vision of GraphQL in their mind, which is in most cases incorrect. So then the education part is super important, just to not create a confusion and just to explain. Even, for example, if you have, sorry, that's my dog. Yeah, so even if you have, for example, reducers, they're pretty much like root fields for your queries, for your GraphQL schema. If you have a selector, basically what you do is a GraphQL query, but in in code, and not as a query, as a string or as an object. So the concepts are basically the same. So
I think one thing that might be a little confusing for GraphQL beginners is the vocabulary, because the words are different, but they mean the same thing. So in Angular, well, in JavaScript, we have CRUD, right? Create, read, update, delete. And in GraphQL, you have queries and mutations. A query is anything you're pulling from the database, and a mutation is anything you're writing back to the database. So it's the same as CRUD. It's the same functionality. And then the interface is basically the same as a schema. And this is the thing, like, you don't have to learn something else, because the schema looks just like the interface, but it's capitalized, right? Like it's so close to being identical. And when you write a GraphQL server, the first time I was very proud, because I wrote a GraphQL server, and I was not a full stack. I was just a front-end developer. It was not that hard. It was like 15 lines of code. It's not that bad.
Yeah, it's pretty much a function, really. So a function that calls another function and orchestrates the work. So yeah.
It's a tiny little bit of code. And there was that, who wrote that? Was that Uri? Who wrote that 7-step full stack tutorial? Do you remember that? That was a long time ago. There was a really good tutorial. There's so many tutorials out there now, I'm sure.
I think it's me, but I think it's are you referring to the WhatsApp clone tutorial, maybe?
I believe so. It was a couple years ago. But I mean, there's a lot of good resources out there. I think if you just like go and try a little bit of it, you're going to be hooked. I remember I don't know if it was Vikings, where I was watching Uri on YouTube. But I stalk him on YouTube, you guys, because Uri has the best images, and I don't know where he gets these like animations from, but some of this stuff,
I know, it's incredible.
Some of this stuff is like high level, and if you haven't done, especially if you haven't done a lot of full stack architecture, if you're just doing like development work, it's confusing to, and he has the best visualizations. Anyway, what I thought was interesting, I don't know what talk it was, but Uri said, everyone in the audience, raise your hand if you've tried Graph, and a bunch of people raised their hands. Maybe, I don't know, 20% of the audience raised their hands. And then Uri said, okay, everybody put your hands down. Now, if you've tried GraphQL and then you decided not to use it and you went back to what you were doing before, raise your hand. And then no one, like everyone that used GraphQL, and that's been my experience too, when I finally get people to use it, they love it, and then they start telling other people, and it's great.
No, that's true
as well. I have that, like a lot of the conversations I have when I do consulting or give talks on GraphQL is it's like people are afraid of change, right? Like it's not so much like it's a new, like when we went from, SOAP to REST, it was probably the same thing. Like this is just the next evolution. I love that wording. This is the next evolution
Chris
of that
is
paradigm.
Chris is
Like we need
driving, I
data.
think.
Yeah, sorry if my sound isn't great. And so if you like, it's just like getting that like foot in the door. Like let me show you how you can get data that and show a different structure. Let me talk about like now we have to have an agreed upon data type. What's and these kind of things. Once you get them in the door, it's like sold because it's so easy to sell. It's just getting them over that initial hump of like, yes, it's a slight change, but it's the next evolution, and here's the benefits you get from it. That has just been like night and day, especially now with microservices growing and you were mentioning earlier, Uri, about co-location of data and those kind of things. Where it's like now it's an easy sell. It's like instead of having to connect to 10 microservices, what if we only connected to one to join them together? And then that's a lot of what we do. A lot of what I've done is making those like just serverless functions that expose a GraphQL API that make REST calls to other things. But then the API, the UI only has to connect to that one GraphQL middleware layer. And it's
Right.
blazing fast. It gets so much out of the gate for you. With Data Loader, you get so many as well. You get so many advantages where it's just like now our app is so much more simplified. And I didn't ask the API team to change everything in the world.
Correct. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think one of the first kind of I think one of the first concepts that I did struggle with when we start thinking about kind of GraphQL on the client, right, was that it seemed like it, a lot of applications would have a lot of state that is local state, right? That is going to be state that is on the front end only, right? It's not a reflection of data that I have in a remote source, right? Like it could be, for example, something to do with the state of a button, and that's kind of affecting multiple components, right? In the UI component tree, right? Or like something like a loading state or whatever, right? And so, or a more complex loading state, right? Where so when it kind of comes to these elements of local state or these pieces of things that these pieces on the UI which don't really have anything to do with the remote data source but which are entirely local, integrating that seemed it seemed to cause a certain amount of dissonance, right? Which was like, wait, but do I get rid of that single store that I used to have, which was maybe in the React world it was whatever Redux, in the Angular world maybe something like Ngrx, which was that do I get rid of that store that I have which helps me maintain a version of the state that is a combination of both remote data and local data, right? And it's a nice kind of combined piece, versus that piece now being owned by this GraphQL API, and then me having to define a GraphQL schema that takes care of that state. And I think that story has still been, I've still been on the fence with that story. It doesn't seamlessly flow one way or the other. What has that experience been like with GraphQL and Angular, right? What are the kind of solutions that have emerged to solving that problem?
I feel like you read my mind because I was just sitting here thinking, hey, we're over halfway through the show and we haven't even started talking about subscriptions yet, because subscriptions are amazing. And then you just brought that up. I think it's really subscriptions. For when I remember when Firebase first came out, and when I was like around Angular version 2, and I was really struggling. And maybe this seems silly to you guys, but so when you're trying to get the real-time updates, right? Because I was just getting into RxJS and trying to figure that out. And so how do I get my RxJS to fire from the database? The only way that I could do that was Firebase, because I actually didn't know WebSockets back then, right? And I didn't know how to do it. And so Firebase would push those updates. And so when you're sitting on top of, and this is another thing that I see time and time again with really big clients, some of them have very old databases. And the problem is, it's like if you've lived in the same house for 20 years and you have so much stuff in the closets, once you get a massive database, it's very difficult to upgrade that, and it's expensive. And so if you get stuck with that massive database and you can't upgrade it, but you still want to have all that brand new real-time functionality, that's where subscriptions come in, and it helps you kind of have that facelift without, and you still have that old dinosaur database, but then you also get that cool new functionality at the same time.
Yeah. And I think kind of I think kind of dealing with subscription updates has, I think, also been an interesting story. I don't think it's been a completely seamless story yet on the front end, because a lot of the subscription updates have historically not updated kind of that local GraphQL cache state well, right? And so perhaps, like, maybe talking about both of those pieces, which is like purely local state, which is state that doesn't come in from the server, and some state that does come in from the server, like subscription events, right? Dealing with that on the front end, dealing with that in the GraphQL cache, you want to call it, or you want to call it the store, the local store that you have, the client side store that you have. That's kind of been an interesting thought for me. So what kind of mental models have you folks formed around it? Uri, Camille, anything?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because sometimes, let's say, you're new to GraphQL, but then you understand the thing and your mind blows up and you're super excited, and then there's two camps. One is like, okay, GraphQL everything, which means, and there's a lot of, and the idea of having both your remote state and your local state basically being part of one schema makes sense in many ways, because first of all, if we look at where people, when they just start using GraphQL, a lot of the local state that they have actually originates from the backend. So the first thing, once you let's say start using, I don't know, let's say just for the most popular example, Apollo client, then suddenly you realize that a lot of the state that you have in your Ngrx store actually originates from the backend. So then you use like a GraphQL client that manages that state, like, in a better way or in a more automated way. And then the idea of, okay, all the local state that I have that should be shared between a couple of components, I can just extend the schema. For example, if I have a user type, and the user type has, like, I don't know, a name and an age, but then which originates from the backend, but then it also has, I don't know, active right now or something like that. Let's say the active right now just lives in your local state, then you can extend that remote schema and have that concept locally. And I see a lot of people actually using that and taking a lot of benefits in that. The other way of, but I agree with you as well that sometimes it's a bit clunky, because sometimes maybe it involves a bit more infrastructure or a bit more knowledge. And also sometimes maybe that state still just originates in one single component or something. So there's no real reason to actually make it a global state. So that's another thing that, maybe that state actually doesn't belong. Like, if we're talking about the React world, like the React context, maybe that's a better place to put it there. But just differentiating between, is it global actually or not?
Yeah, and I think the idea of like extending the GraphQL schema on the client side to enrich it with local state is also interesting, because it does seem fairly neat in kind of what it does, but there are a few kind of hidden ramifications of that, right? Which is one that I think that from kind of like from a performance reasoning standpoint, right? Like from a debugging reasoning standpoint, you suddenly have portions of your cache or store or whatever that behave slightly differently, or the properties are a little bit different, right? Whether you think about latency, or whether you think about the need for doing optimistic updates or not, right? Like some things change a little bit, right? And that suddenly now there's that hidden overhead that it's not quite as seamless as just adding a field, right? You also have to be aware that the behavior of that field is different. And I think the other kind of hidden complexity that is also there is that, if you're basically extending an API or a schema that is a service that is given to you by the GraphQL server, right? What if the GraphQL server tomorrow adds a field that has the same name, for example, right? What if there's a potential clash, right? And again, it's not like a popular, it's not like a thing that will happen very frequently, but but just from a thought process point of view, it does seem to break the model a little bit, right? It's like there is and that's something that I found a little hard to kind of reconcile in my mind, right? Which is like what is the best way of kind of thinking about this? But how have you kind of thought about those problems, those trade-offs?
Yeah, I feel like the local state on the Angular side, GraphQL side, I mean, is not solved yet. I mean, Apollo tried to, but for me, the Apollo 2.0, for example, feels a bit awkward because you have to fit into the normalization of the cache and just, read-write stuff and all kinds of stuff. Right now, it's much better with the type policies and field policies. But for me, I don't know. In most cases that I see in the local state that is combined with the remote data, it's mostly filtering. So then within the component itself, you have this, let's say, a local state, and you want to filter out some results. You can do it within the component. So you end up just reusing the data, filter out the elements in the list, for example. And that's pretty much it, because I don't know, like this is the 90% of the use cases that I've seen. So it's just to filter some stuff or just pick one item from the list. So, it's not like super complicated and advanced, but so then there's no really a benefit, I would say, to actually put it in the GraphQL and then, mark it as a client query or something like that, and then get the result. Because, what you can end up with is just reusing the cache twice, let's say. I mean, the state of which is Apollo cache,
Right.
So I feel like there's some, a missing piece that potentially someone could solve, but I'm not sure why. I'm not sure how exactly.
I think a lot of the things. Sorry. A lot of what I see in those state management, like Camille's talking about, is that you have to put together relationships between the data. So you got to go and get all of this, and then like all of the machines in a facility, and then for all of those machines, you need to get the serial numbers, and then like you have to keep going back and forth, and a lot of the times, all that's being done in the state management.
Yeah. No, there are
which is really shouldn't be, but.
Yeah. There are certain there's definitely certain kind of holes there that are not clear on how to fill, and I think it's also I think that those pieces have kind of been evolving quite quickly as well, right? So it's kind of interesting to understand how that's going to evolve, and I think kind of one of those related kind of topics to that, right, is that is when you've been thinking about kind of this idea of what is kind of the recommended way when people are kind of building Angular applications, of thinking about the relationship that they have of their GraphQL query to their kind of UI components, right? Do people think of it as like, I have this Angular, for example, like I have this page to render, right? Am I going to basically create like one gigantic GraphQL query that is going to fetch all of the data that is required for all of the components in that page, right? So I effectively make like one query that fetches lots of things, and then that information automatically gets propagated down the components. Is that the right way to think about it, or do you have like separate components and each component declares its own GraphQL query, and so the developer of that particular component, writes their own piece of the GraphQL query? What are the kind of ways of thinking that are emerging there? Also, what I'm talking about in the UI component hierarchy, is that even a sensible thing to say, sensible vocabulary to have with Angular applications?
Yeah, I think so. I know what you're hinting at, and I think I think it's kind of like, I always look at where we are in the Angular world. Maybe it's not the nicest thing to say, but it's kind of like a few steps of where the React was in, like, a few months before. So right. I think what we see currently in Angular is like, because we used to come from or one big Ngrx store, or before that some global services. Mm-hmm. We look at and that is completely separated from how we render a component tree. Then usually when people just start using GraphQL, they don't understand all the possibilities, so they try to build this query that basically, or let's call it a page-based query, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like try to understand all data that this page needs to render, and let's start with that. But then what they sometimes learn a bit later is, wait a second, we can use fragments. So we can actually split those data requirements into each individual component, which, if you're talking about real scalable component architecture, that's how Facebook writes components, right? Like each component declares its props or its properties and inputs and outputs when you talk about Angular components, but then also the data requirements as fragments. And then when you want to change something, you change just a single component. You don't need to change the whole tree. So the difference in responsibilities is much better. So I think currently in the Angular world, what we see in the Angular GraphQL world, we're slowly educating people towards that concept.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, and what is kind of that story with fragments been like? Because the kind of experience of using fragments isn't particularly great, right? It's easier from a user experience, from a developer experience point of view, to just attach a query to my component, right, to a small piece of my component, and then have multiple queries. That experience is much easier than having a fragment, and then kind of making sure that fragment is also being, like, would I declare the fragment inside my UI component? Would I declare it in a separate list, and then would I use it would I import, like, I have to import that fragment manually in the parent query and stuff like that, right? That experience is not as smooth as just kind of declaring declaring your own GraphQL query for your particular component. Am I making sense? Is that has that become better with recent kind of GraphQL client work with Angular?
Yeah. So the missing story, I mean the part of the story about the fragments and GraphQL in Angular has a really strong missing piece, and this strong missing piece is the thing that is called, for example, data masking in Relay or fragment collocation. And the fragment collocation right now in Angular is just done that you write a fragment, you put it in a query. This query, as Uri said, is done on the page level, root level, and that's it. So it's. But this is as Uri said, it comes from the concept of services. So you have a service, you ask for data, and you get it all, at once in this particular component. But as you said, it's much more advanced. So what we were talking, I don't know, years ago, we wanted to have this data masking thing, basically the Relay, but for Angular. I started doing some stuff just to give the experience for Angular developer of Relay, because right now there are two packages. One is not maintained, and it was created I don't know, 4 years ago, and it was based on the very old Angular. And there's the new one. I don't know what it does actually, and how is it compatible. Future compatibility between the Relay in React and Relay in Angular. But this is something that that should be done soon, pretty much, I would say. So basically, from the Angular perspective, we miss Relay. that's what I'm thinking. And from the features of Relay, we miss them from the Apollo perspective. So if Apollo will solve it, then we will have it in the Angular.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think there are kind of a few other things that emerge as you start buying into that Relay style of fragments, right? Which is, you realize that the Relay style fragments and fragment collocation only works really well once you have a top level kind of a node interface to your GraphQL schema, right? Once you have the ability to almost let the client side tooling automatically switch between composing all of the fragments together into one gigantic GraphQL query, maybe for the initial load, right? Or if a particular component needs to be re-rendered, right, because the variables change, maybe there was a pagination of a sublist, right, like a nested list went through a pagination, right, or went through a small change like a show more. I click on show more, and I need to see like description, and that component pops up and more data fills in, right? Now, if I want to fill that in with more data, even if it is a fragment, right, I have to rerun the whole query, right? But I don't want to rerun the whole query. I just want to fetch that part. But I've declared a fragment for it, and I can't fetch a fragment, right? I have to fetch the whole query. I can't fetch just a part of the fragment, right? Which makes it weird, because then you're like, I wish that I just had my own query or my own endpoint, like a REST endpoint, to fetch just that piece of data separately, without having to fetch the whole thing. And so then you kind of realize that you need like something like a node interface, or you need to be able to refetch the most granular portion of your data, and then something like the node interface becomes very useful, right? So there's kind of some interesting kind of caveats there, and I think like and I think it kind of like, I think the data co-location story with GraphQL is quite hard to get completely automated and right, because it creates this weird contract, not just on the client, but it's a combination of the client and the server that together need to have a nice contract for that data and component co-location story to really work out. And which is why one of the things that I was mentioning was kind of the SWR style approaches, which let you specify a REST endpoint fetch at a component level, kind of solve the same problem by effectively saying that, hey, we'll aggressively optimize all these REST endpoint fetches, so that even if you're making end queries or whatever, it doesn't feel like that. We'll aggressively cache, we'll aggressively update in the background, we'll do all of the magical stuff that you could have possibly done. And then towards the end of it, you might still end up with an experience that is almost as performant as the overall GraphQL experience, right? So it's very, very interesting. These kinds of like approaches where the trade-offs are so complicated, right? Because it's a combination of developer experience, a combination of the overall performance, and then you can kind of decide which experience to go for, right? So that's also going to be very interesting to kind of see how that part of the story evolves. But do you folks have kind of any more thoughts on that data co-location and GraphQL story? Uri, Bonnie?
I think it's good that.
I think.
I was going to say, you're very demanding, Tanmai, and it's good that these two like a challenge, because every time we get it working and it's really cool, and then all three of you are like, what can we do next? And you just come up with more problems for Uri and Camille to solve. I love it.
I agree with you. I think also for us, so GraphQL, it's a short term, but GraphQL, because it has so many concepts, so many things for us. And for us, it's also, I think, the biggest challenge, because we work, usually with existing code bases and large companies and things like that. So sometimes, introducing Relay and all its concepts directly can be hard. Can be hard to integrate into existing app.
Right.
But we're constantly in that, it's just, where are you in the migration path? And the new Apollo as well, like the Apollo Client 3.0, added all kinds of concepts which lets you gradually adopt some Relay concepts. Together with Relay itself, by the way, became a bit more flexible than it used to be. Like, it used to be that you have to write, node interfaces and, all those things. And now Relay just, if you don't do that, just you kind of like opt out from a lot of different like optimizations that they do by default. So I think it's becoming, both clients are becoming, and there's more clients other than those two, not to like, but just I think it becomes, both of those clients are trying to make it easy to gradually adopt GraphQL and to gradually adopt all those concepts.
Got it. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I think there's still a few ways to go.
Yeah, and I also think, like, generally in the GraphQL ecosystem, I think for some reason the co-location idea, like, people are slowly getting it. Like, they're not there. You see so many people using GraphQL and not completely like adopting this concept, which I think when GraphQL was introduced, that was probably the first thing that they were talking about. But I guess that's also because they kind of like decoupled GraphQL and Relay, so people like slowly, adopted it and things like that.
Yeah. I think it's still. I think a lot of the GraphQL journey today is still a lot about not necessarily very aggressive front end optimizations and things. It's still a lot about just the API integration experience, right? A lot of it is still about saying that instead of me looking at this opaque API endpoint and not knowing what data I'll get, being able to kind of type out my data requirements, auto completing my way through it, and then getting the data that I want. Just that. Forget GraphQL client-side tooling. Forget advanced GraphQL client-side stuff. Just that experience of knowing what data I'll get. That itself solves so much of a human problem, right? That I think that's been a great that's been a good enough start for everything, right? And I think as we kind of get into these more advanced use cases, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of approaches we end up with, right? Because there are a few different kind of approaches. It's interesting that all of them can coexist. So let's see what trade-off of complexity versus simplicity is finally we're finally going to end up with like 10 years later or something, right? So
I think GraphQL actually is right where the complexity meets the simplicity, because sometimes people have so many, especially the big companies, so many APIs going on, and they've got cloud stuff here and there, and so then you can just put it all into GraphQL and make it look pretty.
Yeah. No, that's true, and that's kind of one of the responses to that complexity, right? But yeah, I think we're kind of closing out our 60 minutes here. It was absolutely great having you folks here, and before we wrap up, I'll do a quick round of picks. Tech, non-tech, whatever you folks are into. Pandemic stress busting tips, whatever you folks have on your mind. Bonnie, would love to kind of start off with any picks that you have for us.
I have two really quick picks. Number one, I just started my Angular architecture small group training over on AngularNation.net. So go check that out if you want Angular architect training. And my second pick is actually, I just saw a really great talk from Uri on the Hasura YouTube channel, like from a month ago, talking about GraphQL and Hasura plus Mesh. And it was very cool. I was getting very excited about it. So you have to go watch that. It's only 15 minutes.
Plus one that I'm going to plus one that it's an amazing talk of what the future is going to look like, folks. So should definitely check it out. And your second pick? Oh, wait,
that was the second pick.
This is true.
Yeah.
Camille, any picks for us?
Yeah, I didn't. I'm not prepared, but I would say that with the recent release of Apollo Client 3.0, I would say my pick is actually two things, but they are related. So one is the new version of Apollo Angular, which we wrote with Uri and the guild. And the second pick is that we have a new website. So we took Apollo Angular from the Apollo GraphQL. It's owned by us from the start because we did pretty much like 99.9% of the work there. So right now it's under the apollo-angular.com. So yeah, and if you have any questions, we have like a crisp chat or whatever, and I'm super happy to actually speak about Apollo, Angular, and GraphQL in general, especially in Angular. But yeah,
they also have a migration guide on that new website.
Yeah, that's true. And it's and it's pretty much covers every single step, and it has a before and after, and also the differences between the steps, so you can easily see it, like a git diff, let's say. Oh, and also we have in Angular, there's schematic. So if you run ng update apollo-angular, it will transform and migrate all the code from Apollo 2.0 to Apollo 3.0, like a code modification tool.
That's amazing. That's super useful.
Yeah. It's super easy.
Hey, there was something I saw a while back that was a bunch of GraphQL boilerplates in a repo somewhere. Do you know where that is? I forgot where it is, but I love it.
GraphQL boilerplates.
No. Okay, that's okay. Never mind.
Yeah, there's GraphQL boilerplates, but I'm afraid that sometimes it gets outdated. But now that we have the new website, and we keep the examples always up to date. That's the hardest thing in examples. Like they get outdated, like the second you push them. So now that we're actually like owning the repo, and we're hearing people, and like Camille said, like we have you can just go to the website and there's like this annoying marketing button that you think it's a bot, but you actually, if you click on it, it gets to us, to Camille and me. So if you're like actually going to apolloangular.com, you can just talk to us, and if you get stuck on the migration guide, just like annoy us and we'll answer you. So
annoying marketing button. But any picks for us today, Uri?
For me? Yeah. Okay. So I would say two things. One is I think this week, Victor Safkin from Ngrx wrote a very interesting blog post about Angular, the community, and like reflecting on Angular as an onion. Basically, there's the core, and then there's the whole layers of it. And I think both Ngrx and the Guild, as like two, like I would say, organizations that are building a lot of open source solutions around Angular, have a very similar mindset about that. Like we see, real use cases in the world that are outside of Google. And I think we have a bit sometimes of different perspectives of the best practices of how to use Angular. And I think looking at Angular, I really highly recommend his article, because looking at Angular core, which is amazing, and the Angular team is doing amazing work there, but then looking at teams like Ngrx and the Guild of how we use that core and build stuff around it, I think that will do this approach will do much better for the community than basically all the layers being just the Angular team. So I really like that article. I really like the approach, and I really hope the community will start migrating into that mindset. I think it's extremely important for the future of Angular. And the second pick that I have is actually a blog post that was written a year ago, I think, on the Angular blog, that's called "How We Upgraded a Website with 500 million Annual Users to Angular 7 in Less Than a Day." So it's a long title, but you should, if you're using Angular and it's hard for you to keep up with the versions, I suggest that you read that article. It's written by someone from KLM and written with us as well, the Guild. And we described our approach of how to always be up to date. Even if you have like a huge code base and you're like in a large enterprise application and you feel like nobody will update anything, it's still possible and it's still beneficial. So it's on the Angular blog. Just find it out.
That's awesome. That's awesome. A blog posts of hope are always great. So this is great. Thank you, folks, so much for your time today, and hope to see you next week. Thank you, folks, for tuning in, and have a good day, good night, wherever you folks are. Thanks again, Bonnie, Camille, and Uri, for being with us.
Thank you, Tanmai. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
And I'm not sure when Sarah will come and call.
No, we're still live, but it's
Still
fine.
live.
We can keep
Live.
talking.
Yeah.
I can show like, how to cook things. And,
What have you been cooking these days, Uri?
Oof, nothing. I'm just like cutting onions for cutting salads for my parents. I'm visiting my parents in Israel, so I'm trying to help, but I'm really bad at that. So trying my best.
All right. I'm not sure if Sarah's here, and I don't have access to be able to end the stream. So
we can talk about other things, like how is Hasura doing? Like
Good,
I think,
good.
like
Exciting
in my opinion, I would say, like, and if I can say it, I think, because for many different reasons, a lot of Angular developers are using Firebase heavily, or it's
Right.
very marketed and like the community knows a lot about Firebase. But for years, I was like, we need something that is like Firebase, but based on GraphQL and open source and good. And then Hasura came, and I think like And there's just the benefit of the fact that it's like Firebase, but it's open source, and you can integrate it into large enterprises. And the protocol is open source, so you can at any point in time, customize it or do whatever you want. Is like the one blocker that people had with Firebase.
And I think another very powerful use case has been that kind of what Bonnie was talking about, which was that ability to activate like legacy data, right? So you have data that's kind of lying around, and you kind of want to Firebaseify that, right? Or you want to make that accessible for kind of modern transactional applications, or for modern applications that you want to build stuff with. And so I think in those for kind of all of those kinds of use cases, I think we're seeing a lot of very positive impact. So I think that's kind of been especially amazing. I've been surprised myself at the amount of energy that people have for just legacy transformation, right? They just like, there's so much old stuff that they want to use to make new stuff. It's like you can't make completely new things, right? If you're making completely new things, you're like a startup. But especially in enterprise, what you want to do is you want to make new things off of existing things, right? So I think in those cases, I think combination of Hasura and GraphQL has been extremely good. And I think over the next month, we're going to be adding support for more databases. We're going to be making some major announcements in a few weeks. So that's going to be amazing. And then support for even the NoSQL system towards the end of the year. So that's going to be very, very interesting. But it's hard, but it's very, very interesting.
I was just the first time when it really synced in was like, we had one of our clients, I won't mention names and everything, but Tanmai, you know them, and we talked about it a bit, and they're like really old enterprise client and everything, and then which we did like GraphQL with them on completely different project, and then suddenly they reached out and like, hey, we have this application which used to be like really old and blah blah blah, and then we used Hasura, and because it's open source, we just integrated it into that enterprise, and everything is real time and fast. I was like, whoa, you can use Hasura, and like it's actually working. Like people are actually using this thing, super futuristic thing inside like the oldest places. So it blew my mind.
And inside some old industries also, right? Like not industries that you would expect are like at the cutting edge of like of using modern technology, right? Which is always very, very cool, I think. So that's been super awesome, right? I think like I think there's going to be a lot like, I think there's still a lot of like missing pieces, I think that need to be figured out, right? On the like what we were discussing on the client side. With kind of some of these more nuanced requirements, and then also on the backend side of things. So that's been interesting. I think one of those pieces that I've been just extremely excited about from a computer sciencey point of view has been caching on the server side, and kind of approaches to automating caching on the server side, right? Which I feel like it's like the I feel like this is not often like something that I talk about publicly, and hopefully if this video is ever posted up on YouTube, part will be edited out. Right? but I think my deep down, my belief has been that there are only two things in the world. There is only compute and only data. Everything in the middle is accidental complexity. Everything in the middle does not need to exist. The only thing that needs to exist is the application, which is doing the compute and showing you the results of the compute, and the data, which is kind of where data needs to be. But this piece in the middle, which is this piece that is serving, for example, APIs, right, or API servers that are getting data, is kind of complexity that unfortunately exists but doesn't need to exist. It's because of two technical problems, right? The first technical problem is that you have a security problem, which is that these modern applications are not inside the organization anymore. And the second is a performance problem, where you have you have a speed of light problem. You have this problem where you have mobile devices that are so far away from the database, they're not close. It's not like you can run a complex query right to the database and fetch that data immediately. right? You have hundreds of thousands of people who are all making the same request or different slices of the request, and they have to fetch data, but it's all happening over a network, right? And so to deal with these problems incrementally, we invented these API services in the middle, which solve these problems, right? But these should not exist. Nobody should have to build them. This just disappear. And one of the hard problems that you have to solve, that people have to solve by hand, is application level caching, which is not client side caching, but server side caching that you have to do for dynamic data, right? Like if you notice that there's a query that is a very frequently made query, and it needs to be fetched for multiple users. Like all of us want to fetch the latest list of restaurants in a particular city. And we all need to fetch that data together, right? Often what will happen is that, I mean, you'll have to compute that data every single time for every single user that comes in. So instead of computing it, you cache it in Redis, right? And this is a problem that you have to solve because databases can't cope with that kind of load, right? And they don't have information about, there is this kind of weird kind of information that these databases don't have. So databases can't cache this information automatically. So you have to use an application level cache like Redis, but you shouldn't have to. And so I think one of the things that we've been very excited about is that Hasura as a service has enough information to be able to cache this automatically. So what Hasura does is it says that, if there's thousands of people coming in, because Hasura knows the location of each user, what Hasura can do is automatically determine that all of these 1,000 users, 500 of these people are fetching the same restaurant list of San Francisco. So I can take the San Francisco list of restaurants, which is cached, and serve that out. So this is caching that cannot be done by the database. This is caching that cannot be done by the client. This is caching that you have to do, which we cannot.
What information do you have in Hasura that the Postgres doesn't have?
Authorization.
Oh, okay.
The information of how a user maps to which pieces of data in the database. So the information that user ID 1 fetches restaurants where restaurant.location equal to user.location. This constraint is at the application layer. This constraint is not at the database layer, right? This constraint is at the application layer. So that is the information that you would have used. It's like information that's there in your resolver, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you would have used this information to implement a cache, and that's what caches are. So I think being able to cache that automatically is going to be.
And like going on to your the idea that compute should live on the applications, but then there's still, like you said, the first problem of the fact that this code runs outside of the servers or outside your trusted zone. How do you solve that?
You scope that data.
Theoretically.
Yeah. I think the only way to solve that is you have to create a scoped view of that data. So so every application does get the data, but they get a scoped view of that data. They don't get all the data. So it's almost, for me, it's like if I'm using the application and I have to access data, I get I don't get the full table. I get entries in that table that I can access or I can operate on. I get only those entries that I can read. I get only those operations that act upon my pieces of data, right? And that's
so then you just differentiate operations that need data that is just from you, or operations and if there are operations that needs data that needs to be trusted, then those would still run on the server.
Yes, you would still have to, for better or worse, run them on the server, right? But I think the boundary there is also kind of shifting. It's almost becoming like, if you know that there are some operations that you can't run the client, like sometimes it's not possible to run operations on scope data because fundamentally that operation needs to happen on shared data, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like for example, a bank account transaction, it needs to happen on shared data, or it needs to be completely peer-to-peer, like a distributed ledger or something, right? Which is not possible. So because business does not work that way. Like all businesses want to have centralized data, right? Businesses don't want to decentralize that data, which is, although eventually perhaps the future, right? The business future is that you need to have data centralized. And so in that case, what is also happening is that you need to run some compute that is privileged. But what is happening there is that I think like things like Cloudflare workers are very exciting in that case, right? Because what's happening is that as a developer, your mental model is, I'm just going to write some code. If it is privileged code, let me just run it on the server. But if it's unprivileged code, let me run it on the client.
I see, but then the server is just, the workers are like trusted environment, just closer to you. Okay.
Yes. Workers are like trusted clients, and they have the same properties, right? They have the same properties. They're ephemeral. They're stateless. They're not like application servers. They're more like clients and less like servers, right? All these serverless functions and stuff, right? They're more like clients and less like servers.
Yeah, but you can trust them still in terms of like operating on shared data.
Exactly. You can trust them to operate on a view of data that is that is more privileged than the clients, right? So I think that's how that problem is getting solved, which is,
and that also, like, you can add to that all the things like what that people are starting to write, basically, like, let's say SQL code in their front end, but that is just like being executed on workers or as server-side rendering, basically on a trusted environment, and then you send the result as an HTML thing.
Correct. I mean, which is what people always did, right?
Like classical PHP thing.
Classical PHP is exactly that, right? Classical PHP is exactly that. So
yeah, and when you think about GraphQL, it's kind of like it evolved. There's a really cool talk from two talks from Lee Byron, right? Like one is
on
like
both JSX and PHP and GraphQL, right? That the evolution of these three pieces that happened. Yeah. So that's very interesting. But for all of those people who are still listening to us ramble on, I'm just gonna end the broadcast now. Thanks again for being here, folks. If we could stop the live broadcast, if Sarah's back.
I don't. Do you know how to stop it?